Welcome to Study Session 2, Theories of Industrial Relations. Introduction. In explaining the various theories of industrial relations, it must be noted that classifications are sometimes done. However, such classifications are the convenience of the author. In this study session, we will examine two classifications of industrial relations, namely classical perspective and radical perspective. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to discuss the following classical theories of industrial relation: unitary theory, conflict theory, and pluralist theories. Classical perspectives. Unitary theory. The essence of the unitary theory of industrial relations, held by Alfred Redish in a memo submitted to the Donovan Commission in 1966 and others, is that every work organization is an integrated and harmonious whole existing for a common purpose. They assume that each employee identifies unreservedly with the aims of the enterprise and with its methods of operating. By this view, everyone in an organization shares a common purpose and all are committed to these objectives. This automatically excludes the existence of conflict in any form and certainly an institutional recognition of it. By definition, the owners of capital and labor are joint partners to the common aims of efficient production, high profits, and good pay, in which everyone in the organization has a stake. It follows that there cannot be two sides in industry. Indeed, managers and managed alike are merely parts of the same team. This team, however, is expected to be provided with strong leadership from the top to keep it working and to ensure commitment to the task to be done and to its managerial office holders. Unitary theory expects that management at minimum must have a paternalistic approach towards employees, or at the extreme an authoritarian approach, together with a suitable communication structure to keep employees informed of managerial decisions. On the other hand, employees are expected to remain loyal to the organization and to its management in deference to the common problems facing managers and subordinates alike. So, according to Fox, 1996, unitary theory shows team spirit and undivided management authority coexist to the benefit of all. In short, work organization is viewed by unitary theory as being unitary in structure and purposes, having a single source of authority and a set of participants motivated by common goals. Therefore, industrial relations is assumed to be based on mutual cooperation and harmony of interest between management and workers within the enterprise. Implications of unitary theory. 1. Factionalism within the enterprise or in a part of it is seen as a pathological social condition. Subordinate employees are not expected to challenge managerial decisions or the right to manage, while trade unionism is viewed as illegitimate intrusion into the unified and cooperative structure of the workplace. The theory further confirms that trade unionism competes almost malevolently with management for the loyalty and commitment of employees to their employer. 2. Unitary theory refused to accept the existence of conflict at work, whether between management and employees, between management and unions, or even between the organization and its customers. When conflict does arise, it is the result of the system not working properly, not that the system itself is flawed. Conflict may arise because of mere friction due to poor leadership given by management, breakdown in communication about aims or methods, failure to grasp the commonality of interest or resistance of employees. 3. Collective bargaining and trade unions are therefore perceived as being antisocial mechanisms, since acceptance of two opposed and competing interest groups within the enterprise in the person of management and union representatives only precipitates and crystallizes unnecessary and destructive industrial conflict between what in effect are viewed as two non-competing cooperative parties. This idea contradicts the social function of trade unions. The unitary theory of industrial relations is predominantly managerially oriented in its inception, in its emphasis, and its application. Many managers identify with this because it assures them of their roles as organizational decision makers and legitimizes the acceptance of their authority by subordinate employees. Conflict theory. This is based on the premise that conflict exists in society and in organizations, and it is essential to recognize this and to have a framework that deals with it. In organizations, conflict arises because of the differing values and interests of management and employees. Unions emerged to represent the views of workers, which were different from those of the owing group. The whole basis of collective bargaining in that employers and employees have to resolve their differences, and various institutions emerged to serve this purpose. In order to resolve difficult problems which could not be resolved between the parties themselves, there emerged various institutions and processes to resolve conflict externally. The basis for these various facets of industrial relations is the recognition of conflict. Another angle towards the conflict theory is that work organizations are microcosms of society. Since society comprises a variety of individuals and of social groups, each having their own social values and each pursuing their own interests and objectives, it is argued those controlling and managing work enterprises similarly have to accommodate the different values and competing interests within them. It is only by doing this that private or public enterprises can function effectively. Industrial relations between employers and unions and between managers and trade unionists are an expression of the conflict and the power relations between organized groups in society generally. As such, it is claimed industrial conflict between managers and their subordinates has to be recognized as an endemic feature of work relationships and managed accordingly. Farnham and Pimloth, 1993. Pluralism. Clegg, 1975, said that the idea of pluralism emerged as a criticism of the political doctrine of sovereignty, that somewhere in an independent political system there must be a final authority whose decisions are definitive. Not so, said the pluralist. Within any political system, there are groups with their own interests and beliefs, and the government itself depends on their consent and cooperation. There are no definitive decisions by final authorities, only continuous compromises. A plural society, in other words, is a relatively stable one, but not static. It has to accommodate to different and divergent pressure groups to enable social and political changes to take place constitutionally. This is achieved through negotiation, concession, and compromise between pressure groups and between many of them and government. It is from this analysis of political pluralism that industrial relations pluralism is derived. Just as society is perceived as compromising a number of interest groups held together in some sort of loose balance by the agency of the state, So work organizations are viewed as being held in balance by the agency of management. The pluralist concept of political sovereignty and managerial prerogative have much in common. Trade unions are viewed as the legitimate representatives of employee interests at work with the right to challenge the right to manage. There are also, it is suggested, similarities between the processes of political concession and compromise on the one hand, and of collective bargaining on the other. Above all, the pluralist argues greater stability and adaptability is given to industrial relations by collective bargaining than by shirking and outlawing trade unions. Clegg, 1975. According to pluralist theory, the central feature of industrial relations is the potential conflict existing between employer and employed and between management and managed within work enterprises. Unlike unitary theory, however, trade unionism is accepted as having both a representative function and an important part in regulating conflict rather than in causing it. Similarly, collective bargaining is recognized as being the institutional means by which conflict between employers and employees is regularized and resolved. Industrial conflict, therefore, is accepted by pluralists not only as being inevitable but also as requiring containment within the social mechanisms of collective bargaining, conciliation, and arbitration. Criticism of pluralist theory. 1. Some writers believe that those working within the pluralist framework implicitly accept the institutions, principles, and assumptions of the social and political status quo as unproblematic. In doing so, they add their professional status, personal prestige, and influential involvement in public policy, making the forces and influences which lead the subordinate groups to continue seeing the status quo as legitimate, inevitable, unchangeable, only to be expected. Fox, 1973. 2. Pluralism is also seen as a conservative approach to industrial relations. They believe that the changes it seeks to promote are ones designed to bring about the more effective integration of labor into the existing structure of economic and social relations in industry and the wider society, rather than ones intended to produce any basic alteration in this structure. Goldthorpe, 1974. 3. Nevertheless, despite its critics and a renascent neo-unitarism, industrial conflict theory remains a major theoretical approach to industrial relations in Britain. Yet, whilst collective bargaining fits easily into pluralist theory, consultation or joint problem solving does so to a lesser extent. For this reason, it is useful to distinguish between hard pluralism and collective bargaining, which are conflict-centered, and soft pluralism and joint consultation, which are problem-centered. Theories of industrial relations. Social action theory. Social action theory is industrial relations emphasizes the individual responses of the social actors, such as managers and union representatives, to given situations. Social action theory is preeminently associated with the studies of Max Weber. According to Weber, action is social by virtue of the subjective meaning attached to it by the acting individual. It takes account of the behavior of others and is thereby oriented in its course. Weber, 1896. He insists that in order for social actions to be explained, they must be interpreted in terms of their subjectively intended meanings, not their objectively valid ones. If only observable behavior is examined, it is argued, The significance and value which individual actors place upon their behavior are likely to be misinterpreted. Social action. Then is behavior having subject meaning for individual actors, with social action theory focusing on understanding particular actions in industrial relations, situations rather than on just observing explicit industrial relations behavior. In emphasizing that social action derives from the personal meanings which individuals attach to their own and other people's actions, social action theorists are suggesting that social actors are constrained by the way in which they construct their own social reality. On the one hand, it seems society makes man. On the other, man makes society. Silverman, 1970. Individual actors, however, do not share the same value systems, which mean that individuals attach different meanings to their interactions. Kirkbride, 1977. Managers and shop stewards, for example, do not come together because they have the same goals and values, but because, for a while at least, their differing ends may be served by the same means. Silverman, 1970. The main influences on individuals' social action. Actor, subjective meaning, goals, experiences, norms, values and attitudes, expectations, situation, interactions, social action. The fundamental point is that social action emerges out of the meaning and circumstances attributed by individuals to particular social situations, thereby defining their social reality through interaction between actors such as that between personnel managers and shop stewards, line managers and personnel specialists, stewards and their members, individuals, as well as having an element of choice in interpreting their own roles and in acting out their intentions, also modify, change, and transform social meanings for themselves and others. The major difference between a social action approach in examining behavior in industrial relations and a systems approach is this. Action theory assumes an existing system where action occurs but cannot explain the nature of the system, while the systems approach is unable to explain satisfactorily why particular actors act as they do. Silverman, 1970. The first views the industrial relations system as a product of the actions of its parts. The other aims to explain the actions of its parts in terms of the nature of the system as a whole. Criticisms of social action theory. 1. Marxists argue that those supporting the action frame of reference neglect the structural influences of which the actors themselves may be unconscious, whilst the consciousness of individual actors in the industrial relations system towards its political economic structures can be to some extent autonomous. It is limited in practice. This is because definitions of reality are themselves socially generated and sustained, and the ability of men to achieve their goals is constrained by the objective characteristics of their situation. Ayman, 1977. 2. Perhaps the most useful feature of social action theory in industrial relations is the way in which it stresses that the individual retains at least some freedom of action and ability to influence events. However, the structures of the industrial relations system may influence the actions of its actors. Actors, in turn, also influence the system as a whole, including its outputs. Marxist theory. Marxist interpretations of industrial relations are not strictly a theory of industrial relations per se. Marxism is, rather, a general theory of society and of social change, with implications for the analysis of industrial relations within capitalist societies. Marxist analysis, in other words, is essentially a method of social inquiry into the power relationships of society and the way of interpreting social reality. It is not a definitive political creed. Indeed, there are a number of different schools of Marxist scholarship, social thought, and political action. This means that Marxist thinking is neither necessarily dogmatic nor monolithic, although it can be sectarian. Hence, it is not strictly accurate to refer to a Marxist theory of industrial relations. To understand the relevance of Marxist theory to industrial relation, it is necessary to separate the main features of general Marxist analysis, which contribute to its special character as a means of interpreting relations between the capitalist class and wage earners. Further, Marx himself wrote comparatively little about trade unionism and collective bargaining. Basically, because neither of these institutions were firmly established in Britain when he was studying 19th century capitalist development. Thus, the application of Marxian theory as it relates to industrial relations derives indirectly from later Marxist scholars rather than directly from the works of Marx himself. The starting points for the Marxist analysis of society are the assumptions that social change is universal. Class conflict is the catalytic source of such change, and these conflicts, which arise out of differences in economic power between competing social groups, are rooted in the structures and institutions of society itself. Relations between social groups, in other words, are perceived as being not only dominated by pressures for change, but also encompassed by inevitable internal contradictions which must eventually transform the class-based nature of pre-capitalist and capitalist societies. The conceptual method by which Marxists examine the dynamic character of social relations is described as dialectical materialism. When reality is viewed dialectically, it is seen as a process involving interdependent parts which interact on each other. When reality is also viewed materialistically, it is seen as phenomena predominantly influenced by economic factors. The dialectical relationship between economic factors, therefore, provides the prime motivation for change. This briefly is what Marxist in the first instance is about. Allen, 1976. Dialectical materialism, in other words, assumes that a society's social and political institutions grow out of its economic infrastructure of power base, and that it is from the dialectical conflict between social classes with opposed economic interests that social changes take place. For Marxists, the capitalist or bourgeois state is only one stage in the evolution of human society. The first stage is primitive communism. Feudalism emerges out of this, and from feudalism, capitalism develops. This significance of capitalism, in the Marxist view, is that it is a changing phenomenon which has not done away with class antagonisms but has given rise to new social conflicts within society, those between the bourgeois and the proletariat. The contradictions which persist between those who privately own the means of production in the pursuit of profit, on the one hand, and those who have to sell their labor for wages to survive, on the other, are thus perceived as being irreconcilable in the context of a class-based bourgeois society. For Marxists, moreover, unlike pluralists and unitarists, Political and class conflicts are synonymous with industrial conflict, since the capitalist structure of industry and of wage labor is closely connected with the pattern of class division in society. Amen. 1975. Thus, the conflict taking place in industrial relations between those who buy labor and those who sell it is seen as a permanent feature of capitalism, merely reflecting the predominant power base of the bourgeois and the class relations of capitalist society generally. By this view, class conflict permeates the whole of society and is not just an industrial phenomenon. In the same way, trade unionism is a social as well as industrial phenomenon. Trade unions are, by implication, challenging the property relations whenever they challenge the distribution of the national product. They are challenging all the prerogatives which go with the ownership of the means of production, not simply the exercise of control over labor power in industry. Allen, 1971. Marxist theory and social change. Primitive communism, feudalism, capitalism, class war, dictatorship of the proletariat, socialism, classless society. Implications of Marxist theory. 1. There are both short-term and long-term implications in the Marxist analysis of bourgeois society and of the class-based structure of capitalist industrial relations within society. For example, the class struggle between capital and labor is regarded as being continuous, even where trade unions are absent. It takes place, it is argued, because capitalists and proletarians seek to maintain and to extend their relative positions in the economic power structure, enabling surplus value to be distributed between them. Such conflict is seen to be unremitting and unavoidable. Neither employees individually nor trade unions collectively can be divorced from the realities of these power relations, either by disregarding them or by succumbing to the manipulative techniques of employer persuasion. 2. Trade union organization is viewed as the inevitable consequence of the capitalist exploitation of wage labor. The vulnerability of employees as individuals invariably leads them to form collectivities or unions in order to protect their own class interests. Although many Marxists do not believe that trade unions in themselves provide the basis for revolutionary action, collective bargaining and militant trade unionism, however, cannot resolve the problems of industrial relations in capitalist society. They merely accommodate temporarily the contradictions inherent within the capitalist mode of production and social relations. Indeed, the continuous relationship of conflict, whether open or concealed, stems from a conflict of interest in industry and society, which is closely linked with the operation of contradictory tendencies in the capitalist economic system. Eman, 1975. 3. More significantly, industrial relations become not an end in themselves, but a means to an end. The furtherance of the class war between capital and labor. For by Marxist analysis, bourgeois society inevitably gives rise to political revolution by the proletariat. Out of this emerge a dictatorship of the proletariat, then socialism, and ultimately the communism of the classless society. Trade unionism and industrial relations conflict are merely symptoms of the inherent class divisions within capitalism. They are, Marxists contend, a main element in the working class struggle against capitalist exploitation and in the eventual emergence of a socialist economy, followed by utopian communism. The system theory. A different approach to providing a framework for understanding industrial relations is the system approach. System approach was postulated by an American, John T. Dunlop, in his book Industrial Relations System, published in 1958. His aim was to present a general theory of industrial relations and to provide tools of analysis to interpret and to gain understanding of the widest possible range of industrial relations, facts, and practices. An industrial relations system is not, for Dunlop, part of a society's economic system, but a separate and distinctive subsystem of its own, partially overlapping the economic and political decision-making systems with which it interacts. In his view, systems theory provides the analytical tools and the theoretical basis to make industrial relations an academic discipline in its own right. According to Dunlop, it is this network or web of rules consisting of procedures for establishing the rules, the substantive rules themselves, and the procedures for deciding their application to particular situations, which are the product of the system. The establishment and administration of these rules is the major concern or output of the industrial relations subsystem of industrial society. Dunlop, 1958. These rules are of various kinds and may be written, oral, or custom and practice. They include managerial decisions, trade union regulations, laws of the state, awards by governmental agencies, collective agreements, and workplace traditions. Furthermore, they cover not only pay and conditions, but also disciplinary matters, methods of working, the rights and duties of employers and employees, and so on. It is the rules of industrial relations which have to be explained by the independent variables of an industrial relations system. As can be seen from below, there are three sets of independent variables or factors in an industrial relations system: the actors, the context, and the ideology of the system. Simple model of an industrial relations system. J.T. Dunlop, Industrial Relations Systems, Southern Illinois University. Processes: inputs, outputs, actor, bargaining, conciliation, arbitration. Environmental context, ideology, lawmaking, etc. Rules, feedback. From the figure above, Dunlop identified three independent variables or factors in an industrial relations system: the actor, the context, and the ideology of the system. A. The actors. These are the people and organizations involved in the system. This includes the hierarchy of managers and their representatives, a hierarchy of non-managerial employees and their representatives, and the specialized third-party agencies, whether governmental or private, which operate within the system. B. The context. These are the main elements of the environment within which the system operates. These include the technological aspects, the budgetary and market constraints, and the locus of power in society. Dunlop regarded technology as being particularly important and having far-reaching consequences in determining industrial relations rule-making. Technology, for example, affects the size of the workforce, its concentration or dispersion, its location and proximity to the employees' places of residence, and the duration of employment. It also influences the proportions of skills in the workforce, the ratio of male to female workers, and health and safety at the place of work. An industrial relations system also has to adapt to the product markets or to the budgetary constraints of the enterprise. Although this impinge on management initially, they ultimately concern all the actors in a particular system. Such constraints may be local, national, or international. Dunlop considers, for example, the balance of payments to be a form of market constraint for national systems of industrial relations. Furthermore, in Britain, voluntary organizations like charitable trusts and nationalized industries are no less constrained by budgetary forces, for example, than are private businesses. These constraints are no less operative in planned economies than in market economies. C. By the locus and distribution of power in the larger society. Dunlop means the distribution of power outside the industrial relations system, which is given to that system. This is important because the relative distribution of power in society tends to be reflected within the industrial relations system itself. Yet, it need not necessarily determine the behavior of the actors in industrial relations. It is rather a context which helps to structure the industrial relations system itself. The distribution of power within the larger society is particularly likely to influence the state's specialist industrial relations agencies. National industrial relations system reflects such societal power. D. The ideology of the system. This is the set of beliefs held by the participants that allowed them to operate the system. According to Dunlop, 1958, the ideology of the industrial relations system is a body of common ideas that defines the role and the place of each actor and that defines the ideas which each actor holds towards the place and function of the others in the systems. E. The ideology of an industrial relations system, he says, must be distinguished from that of the wider society. Nevertheless, they will be expected to be similar or at least compatible with each other. Each of the main sets of actors in an industrial relations system might even have its own ideology, but the hallmark of a mature industrial relations system is that its constituent ideologies are sufficiently arguent to allow the emergence of common set of ideas which recognize an acceptable role for each in the system. In this respect, Dunlop quotes, "The ideology of voluntarism or legal abstentionism has been traditionally accepted by the parties in the British system of industrial relations." Criticism of the system theory. 1. Writers have criticized system theory for lack of analytical rigor and having static view of industrial relations. They have suggested that the model requires refinement and development. They argue that Dunlop's systems theory used the term system in a too loose and undefined manner. 2. In concentrating on the structural or static features of industrial relations, system theory has omitted to provide a framework for analyzing the processes or dynamics of industrial relations decision making. 3. Little emphasis is placed upon the actors' definitions of social structure and how the interaction between structure and definition influence social action. Fatchett and Whittingham, 1976. 4. Some writers in industrial relations rejected the system theory because they associated system theory with consensus theories, which assumes that there are no long-term fundamental deficiencies or interest on society. These writers hold the opposing view that conflict is endemic in capitalist societies and that is manifested in industrial relations situations where the confrontation between capital and labor is most apparent. Study session summary. In this study session, we discuss the classical theories of industrial relation into unitary theory, conflict theory, and pluralist viewpoints of conflict theory. Criticism of these theories were equally looked into. We also explored the strengths and weaknesses of the radical school of thought in theories of industrial relations. Theories discussed are social action theory, Marxist theory, and the system theory. End of study session 2. Thank you for listening.